The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is David Wright, and I'll be the host for today's webinar, which is really cool, actually, because we're discussing the value and importance of service desk benchmarking, which is really, really important, and hopefully we'll find out more today. So we've been working, Service Desk Institute has been working very closely with our guest speaker today, and SDI and Metronet. Well, we've been developing metric-based benchmarking services that can really change and improve service capability in many organizations. So we'll be touching on some of those in this webinar. And joining us today, as you can see there, much better photo than mine, Jeff, to be honest. Joining us today is Jeff Rumburg, and Jeff obviously is a very close friend of SDI's and a partner. Hi, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, David, I'm doing just great. Thanks for inviting me today.
It's always a pleasure, Jeff. It's always a pleasure. We always have good conversations, don't we? So that's really, really great. And you know, Jeff, I think before we go into this, as a practitioner, certainly coming from 20 years of practitioner, and probably like many of the listeners will be asking themselves today, I think, I used to ask the same types of questions every day, and they usually were, what does a productive service desk look like? What does that look like? How much more business value could my service desk create through improving efficiencies and productivity? And how do I know? Yeah, what do I increase? How do I know? Where do I get the data from? How do I use that data to improve the customer experience? Where do I start? So I'm hoping we'll sort of cover off much of those points in today's discussions, Jeff, and especially I think in light of today's sort of modern data-driven organizations and data-created services and data science. I think the world is shifting very quickly. And obviously, Jeff, as well, we'd like the listeners to get involved if possible. So if you've got any burning questions that you'd like to ask listeners in relation to data, benchmarking, and how to get the most out of that data to support continual improvement, please use the panel at any time. Just type a question in, and we'll pick those up either as we go through today's session or at the very end. Okay, brilliant. Okay, then, Jeff. So maybe to kick off, I think it would be great for the listeners and ourselves maybe just to learn a little bit more about you. So if you could share some information, maybe your background, a little bit about Metronet maybe, and how you got into data and service benchmarking.
Sure, I'd be happy to, David. Thank you once again for inviting me today. This year, 2019, marks my 30th year in the industry of IT service and support. I started out doing benchmarking for information technology organizations, and that quickly evolved into a specialty in benchmarking IT service and support. And I've now had the good fortune and the honor of having benchmarked more than 4,000 IT service and support organizations worldwide in virtually every industry, nonprofit, and state local government organization you can imagine. And during that time, I've been able to learn about what the success factors in the industry look like. What are the practices and processes that are common to the industry's top performers, those organizations that consistently exceed customer expectations and do so in an efficient manner. So when you think of better, faster, cheaper, better means higher quality customer transactions, better customer experience. Faster means quicker resolution times, and cheaper, of course, means the lowest cost possible. And there's a lot of ways that you can achieve these objectives. But through the 30 years that I've worked in this industry, as I mentioned, I've had the honor of working with more than 4,000 IT service and support organizations, and typically they are looking to improve the quality of support, reduce their costs, make themselves more efficient, and reduce cycle time on resolutions.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think, if anybody has read your CV, your resume, it's incredible, actually. I think where you started all this off 30 years ago, to be honest. And Jeff, to be honest, right, you must have started when you were 10, because you're looking way too good to be 30 years in this industry, I think it's fair to say.
Right.
So that's
my high school yearbook photo.
So yeah, it's really interesting because I know we've discussed all this before, and maybe we can touch on the amount of data that you've gathered, maybe over that time. And certainly, I know that you've worked, you're a VP with Gartner for a time. So I think some of that best practice data stuff that you've, the experience and skills you've developed over those 30 years. So we're gonna start maybe, Jeff, with some key questions, and we'll mix and mingle through some of this, I think. But let's start with why. I think, Simon Sinek, I don't know if anybody in the audience or yourself, Jeff, has read some of Simon's books, but one of his great ones is Start With Why. It's a great place to start. So why do organizations benchmark, Jeff? What's the point? Why benchmark?
Well, benchmarking is known as one of the most productive and efficient tools for engaging in continuous improvement. So organizations that undertake benchmarking are looking to improve their performance. Many organizations engage in what's called internal benchmarking. They just plot their own performance against their past performance, and they call that internal benchmarking, but that's really just trending. That's really just reporting. Benchmarking looks externally at other organizations that operate in a similar environment, similar scope, similar scale, complexity, and geography. And it compares you to an external peer group, and it answers critical questions. How efficient are we? What are our mean times to resolve compared to the industry? How effective are we? What does our customer experience, customer satisfaction, net promoter score look like relative to an external peer group? It enables you to identify performance gaps, diagnose why those gaps exist, and then act on those gaps to mitigate or eliminate negative performance while perpetuating the positive performance. So most organizations undertake benchmarking with the expectation of improving their performance and then continuously improving and ultimately achieving world-class performance.
And that's interesting. You make the difference between internal benchmarking and external. And I think certainly, again, as a practitioner, we spend an awful lot of time looking at the efficiencies and benchmarking ourselves internally. And I think we found it, obviously, I come from outsourcing in a very competitive environment. Trying to get that data to benchmark against was very, very, very challenging, to be honest. And I'm wondering generally, Jeff, when you deal with the organizations you work with, do they typically use the data to understand any key things? Are there key things that they want to identify to make them better? You mentioned, for example, net promoter score. You mentioned mean time to resolve. Are there any key metrics you think that they're looking at to be better?
Yeah, David, when we benchmark an organization for a level 1 service desk, as an example, we look at 45 different key performance indicators. Wow. And when we benchmark desktop support, we look at about 30 different key performance indicators. And those metrics are organized into categories: cost metrics, quality metrics, service level metrics, agent or technician metrics, quality metrics, and so on. However, there's an 80-20 rule when it comes to benchmarking. You don't necessarily need to use 45 metrics to benchmark your organization or 30 metrics to benchmark desktop support. There's a handful of critically important metrics. At level 1, it's cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, first contact resolution rate, there's agent utilization, there's job satisfaction or agent job satisfaction, and then there's some service level metric. It might be ASA, average speed of answer, or it might be percent of calls answered within 60 seconds, for example. There's a very similar set of metrics on the desktop support side, but that limited number of metrics is really the 80-20 rule when it comes to benchmarking. You can benchmark an organization very effectively with those 6 metrics at level 1 and a very comparable set of metrics in desktop support.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I think when people, our listeners, maybe join this, understanding that there is so much data or there is so much key benchmarking sort of data statistics to look at in not only first line but desktop as well is really, really appealing, because I'm assuming you can marry those two up, so you can lead from one set of data efficiency wise into another set of data, which is pretty cool, I suppose. And coming on to data, you mentioned 30 years, Jeff, and utilizing that data over that time. Where does all that data come from then? Is that simply sort of practitioner data that you have then to enable benchmarking? Where do you get that data from?
Yeah, so those 30 years consist of 12 years at MetricNet, and then almost 10 years at Gartner before that. And before that, a company that I started called the Verity Group, which I sold to Gartner. And then before that, I did a stint at McKinsey. And the data comes from organizations that we do benchmarking with. Part of the part of the initiative when we conduct a benchmark for an organization is that they sign what's called a data reuse agreement. It gives us the right to reuse their data on an anonymous basis. We're not going to disclose where the data comes from, but we get to use the data again. Now, when we conduct a benchmark, we use data that's 12 months old or less. We don't go back more than 12 months, except if we're trending. The reason we do that is because data ages very quickly. Let me give you an example, David, of a couple of metrics that are evolving very rapidly. One of those metrics is channel mix. What percent of your contacts come in through voice, chat, web submit, walk-up, for example, self-help. The channel mix metrics are evolving very quickly. Likewise, metrics like percent resolved level 1 capable, which is a desktop support metric, that is also evolving very quickly. And so when we do benchmark an organization, we use data that's 12 months, within the last 12 months, but the data comes from other organizations that we benchmark with. There's a bit of a viral effect, which is that unless you've got a lot of benchmarks in your database, you're not going to have much data there. And we're fortunate in the sense that we've got data going back almost 30 years. And typically when we benchmark an organization, we're able to find peer groups that are in the range of anywhere from 20 to 40 other peers that are comparable, once again, in scope, scale, complexity, and geography. So the data comes from other organizations that we benchmark.
That's really interesting. And you made a fair point. I was going to touch on that, Jeff, actually, about the validity of the data over time. You know, I suppose if you look at data that's 30 years old, then how valid is that at any one point in time beyond that, I suppose? And you've answered it, but let's go back to that for a second, if I could. So you mentioned channel mix, absolutely imperative, I think. You're right in what you're saying. The old school, you know, 2-channel mix of phone and email, I think pretty much is a dinosaur now. And we still see a lot of organizations have those as the two main channels, but certainly seeing that either changing, reshaping, or even closing email channels, and organizations picking up on different ways to do things. Obviously, that drives efficiency. And I suppose when you look at Generation Y, or you know, looking at the way that younger people use how they contact organizations through different channels, user choice, and technology change. I mean, all that adds up to very rapid change over time. And that channel mix for me, out of interest, Jeff, what are you seeing out of that data? What are you seeing at the minute, maybe, at the top headline shift in channel when we talk about channel usage? What are you seeing in that data?
There are two big drivers of channel mix. One is economic. If you can drive contacts out of voice and into chat, or out of chat and into self-help, you're going to be reducing the cost per ticket or the cost per contact. So there's an economic driver to channel mix where organizations are actively trying to deflect contacts into lower cost channels. There's also a demographic driver. If you look at those that are newer to the workforce, they would much prefer self-help over a phone call, or they would prefer a chat over a phone call, for example. So the demographics are in favor of the lower cost indirect channels. Likewise, the economics are in favor of that, but you never want to force a user down a particular channel. You don't want to force them to use self-help when they don't want to use self-help. You don't want to force them into a chat channel if they're not comfortable in the chat channel. So there's a fine balancing act that effective support organizations engage in, because they want to offer channel choice, and they ultimately want to create incentives to drive volume into the lower cost channels. And again, there's both an economic and a demographic driver there, but you have to make those experiences positive. So if someone, for example, tries the chat channel, you want them to have a good experience. If they go to the self-help portal, you want them to have a good experience, because those self-help calls are only about $2 US compared to a voice call in North America last year, where the average cost was about $22 US. So if you can create incentives to use that channel and the customer has a good, robust experience in that channel, they will adopt, they will become loyal to that channel. So there's a lot going on with channel mix. Two big drivers, economic and demographic. Ultimately, it's good for the user and it's good for the organization providing the support. Again, provided that you offer a good experience in those alternative channels, alternative to voice.
And I'm assuming then, with access to peer data to benchmark, an organization could radically change the way that they approach their channel mix and improve directly from using that data. I mean, it's a simple, instead of, the old school sort of iterative, well, wrong word actually, but waterfall improvement, CSI type thing. This is, you're talking really and getting to the nuts and bolts of how other organizations are positively changing mix. So you can make those changes, should they be right for the organization, as well, using that data, which is really, really interesting, actually, Jeff. And I recently read that actually 75% of the workforce will be YGen by 2025. So, I think we're going to see much, much more change, as much, if not more change that we've seen over the last 5 years in relation to supporting organizations and how consumers of support sort of get access to support channels themselves, which is really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the very least, benchmarks will open your eyes to the possibilities. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that you're running a level 1 service desk and 80% of your volume is voice, and then 15% of your volume is chat, and then 5% gets done in the self-help portal. And I present you with benchmarking data that shows that the average organization worldwide now accepts less than 50% of contacts through the voice channel, more than 30% are chat, and close to 20% is going through the self-help portal. That's going to open up your eyes to the possibilities of what could be if you got serious about deflecting contacts into lower cost channels and offering effective alternative channels to voice and chat to those users who might be interested in going to a self-help portal to do their password reset, to get an FAQ, for example. So if nothing else, benchmarks will open your eyes to the possibilities of what could be a brighter future for your support organization.
And I like the point you made about the demographic in an organization. As we've all seen them. I think I've been in organizations where the senior management team are of a certain sort of type, and that in some cases can hold back the way in how quickly an organization changes to be better. And that demographic thing is really important, I think, and certainly the validity of using something like, benchmarking service to support decision making, maybe to influence, Jeff. Is that a vehicle maybe for influencing change as well, I assume?
Mm-hmm. It absolutely can be, David. I think when presented with objective industry data, it could be anything from cost per ticket to channel mix to first contact resolution rate to net promoter score, customer effort score. When presented with objective industry data, once again, it opens up your eyes to the possibilities, but it also instigates and motivates change within the organization. Because if I see that organizations are able to achieve an 85% first contact resolution rate and 92% first level resolution rate, and 40% of their volume is going into chat and 25% is going into self-help, that's going to be very motivating for me. One of the interesting data points, David, in my mind is that when I got started in this industry, like I said, almost 30 years ago, or just about 30 years ago, the #1 category of ticket was password reset. And here, 3 decades later, the #1 category ticket is still password reset, and that boggles my mind because it's low-hanging fruit. There are many good tools out there that enable organizations to let their users self-authenticate. And if 25 to 30% of your volume is password reset, and you can move just half of that, or better yet, 3/4 of that to a password reset tool, you are going to reduce contact volume dramatically for live agent support. So that's another example of how you can drive volume into lower cost channels just by offering a technology tool. And many organizations simply don't take advantage of that, but once they see the benchmarks, they begin to realize what the possibilities are.
And that's really interesting, Jeff, because I think, certainly when we're in practitioner land, we're delivering a service, we've got SLAs to meet, we've got people to manage and people to support, we've got customers, and all that, I think you can lose sight really. And I'm a big believer in using data in three senses really: hindsight, to understand what happened in the past; insight, to understand what's happening now; to create foresight. And we've seen that. I think, if we mentioned earlier, actually, today's sort of modern data-driven organizations, data-driven services, data science, really, that's all really changing what we are, I think, in the industry. And I think some people argue that the use of data is sort of fueling the fourth industrial age where we are now, in the same way maybe that coal or fossil fuels maybe fuel the last industrial revolution, or the data is the new oil, which is really interesting, really. And what I'd like to get to is just a step below that, Jeff. And I know we've talked about this subject before, but using data to create sort of balanced scorecards. So let's maybe touch on some of that, right? And funny enough, SCI recently, we put out a member report, I think it was last week or the week before, which touched on balanced scorecards, and I know that you lent some of your support to that as well. So let's talk about balanced scorecards for a little bit, if we could. What are they, Jeff? And how do they add value? And how would an organization practitioner go around creating a balanced scorecard?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I just want to comment on hindsight, insight, and foresight.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know how long it took you to come up with that, David, but I think you have a future as a rapper here. I like that. Hindsight, insight, and foresight. So balanced scorecards represent an opportunity to turn data from observation into insight and action. And I think I saw the article you were talking about. I believe Scarlett wrote it. And it was an excellent white paper that talked about how you can combine and aggregate a small number of metrics to create a single overall measure of performance for a service desk or a desktop support organization or a hybrid level 1 and desktop support organization. The balanced scorecard will aggregate metrics such as the the 6 that I mentioned earlier: your cost per ticket, your customer satisfaction, your first contact resolution rate, your agent utilization, your agent job satisfaction, and your ASA, or percent of calls answered in 30 seconds. It will weight each of those metrics according to its relative importance. It will combine them into an overall score that allows you to compare your performance to a comparable peer group of other support organizations, and it will give you a score that ranges from 0 to 100%. Now, the value, David, is that no single metric tells you the whole story on service and support. If your costs are going down, you might think that's good, but not if you're sacrificing the quality of the customer experience or your service levels. Conversely, if your customer satisfaction is going up, that might sound good, but not if your costs are rising more quickly than that. So the balanced scorecard does, in fact, force you to take a balanced look at your performance. It doesn't let you go too far in any direction, too far in the direction of quality, too far in the direction of efficiency, too far in the direction of aggressive service levels, and it forces you to make intelligent trade-offs about where you want to operate within the organization. That's the true value of the balanced scorecard. It gives you that balanced picture of your aggregate performance by combining those metrics, normalizing those, and giving you a single overall score that you can then compare to other organizations to see in the aggregate how you're performing. One final point is that metrics typically are used by organizations only for observational purposes. They'll look at them, they'll create nice reports, they'll see a trend, but unless you're willing to gain insight, and this gets to your hindsight, insight, and foresight comment, unless you're willing to look deeper and gain insight, you can't do anything with those metrics. And so we think observation is good, but what you really need is diagnosis and then action. In other words, you've got to be able to interpret the metrics. You've got to be able to diagnose what's going on, because if you can diagnose what's behind the direction of the metrics, you can do something about it. You can act on them. And that's ultimately what we're after with a benchmark and with metrics in general, is that we don't want just pretty reports. We want insight. We want diagnosis. We want action that leads to continuous improvement.
Yeah, I agree. And personally, coming from 20 years of sort of practitioner land, I think I'd like to think that the horizon is changing, but the sort of playing field is changing. When we talk about things like SLAs, historically, it's always, for me, my experience, right? It's always been about achieving the SLA, whatever in whatever shape that is. And we know the sort of analogy of sort of green on the outside and red on the inside, that melon sort of thing, And I love the point you made around intelligent trade-offs, and really where we look at in a service environment, how that should be more of an emphasis rather than just meeting a single number. You said it yourself, no single metric tells the whole story. So I really like that, and I'm hoping that we'll see organizations change their sort of outlook when it comes down to things like SLAs, and how things like peer-to-peer benchmarking adds more value. It adds more value to making decision makings and those intelligent trade-offs, which is really, really cool, actually. So that's great. So we talked about maybe the balanced scorecard, how to create it, and there's plenty of plenty of stuff that we'll be pushing out, I think, in a joint sense around that over the coming sort of months and weeks and months. What about the types of quick wins, Jeff? What about, if we're in a situation where we've created advanced scorecards, and I'm talking really at the lowest level, I suppose, what type of quick wins can you expect to achieve when you're looking at benchmarking, using that information, maybe extending externally to external data? What type of quick wins have you seen organizations manage to affect through using this type of approach?
Yeah, David, it really depends on what your starting point is. Different organizations are going to have different opportunities. We've already briefly discussed one of the most common quick wins, which is channel mix. When organizations realize that they are dominated by the expensive channels, walk-up, voice, even chat is about 80% of the cost of a voice transaction. When they begin to realize that if they have a robust user self-help, self-service portal, they can reduce the cost per ticket or the cost per contact by about 80%. Oftentimes that's a quick win. We were working with a major airline in North America a couple of years ago. They were hovering at around 4% user self-help, self-service, and they decided to make a significant investment in knowledge, and they started populating that self-help portal. They put a natural language query search engine at the front end of that. And in under a year, they had the self-help volume up to almost 20%.
Cool.
And that reduced their aggregate cost by about 15%. So channel mix oftentimes represents an opportunity, low-hanging fruit, if you will. Another is first contact and first level resolution rate. A lot of organizations don't realize that FCR is the biggest driver of customer satisfaction. And by establishing a goal there, and then by empowering agents with knowledge, training, remote tools like BombGuard, LogMeIn, et cetera, you can sometimes dramatically improve the FCR by 10, 15, even 20 percentage points, which has the effect of dramatically improving your customer satisfaction. So just raising the awareness of certain metrics, channel mix, first contact resolution rate, first level resolution rate, which is a proxy for total cost of ownership. And then I know we're going to talk about ROI a little bit later, so I won't dive into it, but I will say that creating that paradigm that says service and support actually creates value, and we can prove that through ROI calculations. But the big wins, David, in my opinion, are typically in the area of channel mix and first contact resolution.
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense, actually. And we will come on to ROI and value, I think, a little bit later. I tell you what, you've mentioned an example of working with one organization. What other sort of wow stories have you got, Jeff? Any other examples of what organizations have achieved through benchmarking? Because I'm sure I'd love to hear some of those, actually. Any sort of wow stories, maybe?
Right. We're working with an organization right now, a major hospitality company in Europe, and they've got 9 separate support desks. They've got an intake desk that basically triages customer tickets and customer contacts, and they'll do the easy things like password resets, but then they triage out to what's called a technical support desk that's run by a managed service provider in the Philippines, and then they have 7 separate what they call business process desks. One of them handles the reservation system. One of them is what is called a revenue desk, and so on. And when we benchmarked them against other hospitality organizations, they realized that these other organizations didn't have separate service desks. They rather had a single service desk with skills-based routing. And so they, these other service desks would cross-train their agents to manage multiple queues. They'd work in the reservations queue. They would also work in the hotel management queue or the hotel support queue, and so on. And what came out of that benchmark, it was the notion that you don't need 9 separate service desks. What you really need is a virtually consolidated service desk with skills-based route and cross-trained agents. Now, not every agent has to be cross-trained in every skill queue, but each agent can start in one skill group and then eventually learn a different skill group and possibly even 3 skill groups. So you avoid the diseconomies of scale that sometimes happen when you do skills-based routing, but you create a virtually consolidated organization, and we managed to reduce our costs pretty dramatically by virtually consolidating their support desks, both the technical support line, the intake line, and then the 7 application skill groups into a single virtual service desk, gave them scale economies, and allowed them to improve it allowed them to improve their economics fairly dramatically, and at the same time avoid the number of hops. If a user calls in, it's the first call, and then you hop to a different skills-based route or skills queue, for example. We reduced the number of hops dramatically, increased first contact resolution rate, and created a single virtual service desk where there was one-stop shop, single point of contact. All users, both in the hotels and in the corporate organization, have a single number to call now, and they reach the global service desk, is what it's now called, because they were able to see from other organizations that it is possible to create a single queue and avoid the diseconomies of scale that sometimes happen when you've got multiple skills-based routes.
That's really interesting, because I think what you described there, probably many of our listeners will ask themselves, well, yeah, that's a great story. I can understand the economies of scale, but how does that affect me? Well, I think what you just said there really is shift left. If you look at it, if you break it down, that's really shift left. It may not be a technical shift left, but you're moving, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, you're moving potentially more expensive work by skilling and administration and pushing that to the front line. That's pretty much shift left, and obviously system thinking as well, where you're taking the service closer to the customer. So there are massive benefits there from that, I should imagine.
Absolutely. A lot of what had been going on in the field at hotels and local offices by local technicians was moved into remote support. And worldwide, the average cost of a desktop or field services ticket is over $100 US, whereas worldwide, the average cost of a level 1 ticket is under US $20. So the cost difference is about 5 to 1, 5 times more expensive if you do it locally, device side, desk side. And that's why shift left is such an important economic phenomenon, is because every time you shift left, and it's not just desktop support to level 1, it's vendor support to level 1, or it's field support to level 1, or it's level 1 to self-help, self-service, and ultimately to level -1, meaning that through problem management, you eliminate the source of these tickets altogether. And that's the best ticket of all, is the ticket that never happens. So shift left will continue to be an important phenomenon in this industry. And for organizations, this is another piece of low-hanging fruit, you had mentioned that earlier, is that shift left for organizations that have not been active in this process of moving tickets to the left into lower cost channels, lower cost resolution. There's oftentimes huge opportunity there. The same company I mentioned earlier, large insurance company, this is from the very first example I mentioned that I've been working with here in the United States, managed to, over the course of 18 months, reduce their ticket volume by almost 50% by engaging in active problem management. And they wouldn't have even known that that was possible until they saw in a benchmark that their users were producing about 2x the number of tickets on a monthly basis that their peers were. So they were up about 1.9 tickets per user per month. Their peers were at about 0.95 tickets per user per month. And they said, what's going wrong? And I said, you're just not doing anything in root cause analysis. And there's a lot of opportunity there to eliminate these incidents and these service requests at their source.
That's really interesting, Jeff, because it does add another layer. You talked about the speed and change over 30 years, right? And channel blend and channel mix. I think certainly what we're seeing is, in the short term and long term, the converging of support services in an organization, because it doesn't have to be a technical support service, it could be non-technical as well. And I think with the advent of machine learning, with AI, with automation, we'll see a natural convergence because of what you just said. Shifting work into a more virtual sort of environment, a sort of touch and orchestrated environment. So I think what's really resonating with me is access to that data can really shift the whole perspective of what it is to be, a support operation at any part of the organization. And coming off the back of that, Jeff, if we talk about AI and automation and machine learning, have you started to develop any data which will give an organization that type of insight?
Absolutely. What we find, David, is that those organizations that have the most robust self-help portals are generally supported by an AI bot. It might be Watson, which is an IBM product and rebranded for something else. Many organizations organizations. It might be Smart IO. There's a lot of different bots out there, and they do learn over time. They'll do what you tell them to, and over time they become more intelligent. And self-help, self-service is becoming a lot more robust as a result of AI, where a customer calls in, and in some cases they don't even realize they're interacting with the bot. They can speak in natural language about what their issue is. It might be that they're lacking connectivity on one of their devices. It might be that they can't sync some of their devices. It might be a question about a proprietary business application that they are locked out of. There's a lot of different things that bots are starting to do, and we're only scratching the surface right now in terms of the emergence and the manifestation of AI in the service and support environment, but there's massive opportunities there. It's going to be good for the user, it's going to be good for the industry, and for those professionals that work in the industry, in my opinion, it represents great opportunity, because essentially it's the easier, right now at least, it's the easier tickets that get handled by AI, and what's left over is a more complex set of tickets. That's good for those that work in the industry, because it gives you an opportunity to focus on higher value add activities, whether it's a voice, a chat, or a walk-up transaction, because AI will initially take over the easy and handle the easier tickets, while the agents will handle a more complex ticket set. That'll be manifested in longer handle times, and in some cases, at least initially, lower first contact and lower first level resolution rates.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, and it's great. It's a great topic. And what interests me, Jeff, is that if you've got data where an organisation can really understand some of that insight to create foresight, that is a brilliant, absolutely brilliant sort of step up the ladder, if you like, in understanding that. And that's got me thinking a little bit. Recently, as we probably know, many of the listeners would have known that IDL 4 has come out, and IDL 4 has got some very key guiding principles. And I'm just looking at some of those now, Jeff, in relation to what we're discussing. And there's some key things that jump out for me. One is the focus on value, and we'll come on to that. Two is start where you are, which is really interesting again, because, you know, with data, that's where you start. And also there's other ones like about iteratively changing, and certainly that last bit which you covered off, the optimizing and automating. So do you know that the thing is, you know, what you have got, the data, sort of fits hand in glove with some of those points. So it isn't just about IT service management. It's really more about sort of value management. It's really about IT value management. I think certainly that's where I'm really interested in, is understanding what that value means. So let's come on to value. You know, focus on value, one of the first guiding principles. Now we've talked at length about the difference between a cost center and a value center, and what that means to return on investment. So Jeff, I'll ask you that now. What is the difference between a cost center and a value center? And how do organizations move from a cost model, simply linear cost, into more about value?
Yeah, David, a cost center is a cost of doing business, pure and simple. So if you have office space, if you have insurance, if you have utilities, gas and electric utilities, those are a cost of doing business. They are cost centers. And the goal with any cost center is to minimize the cost, because it's not adding any value. It's not creating a competitive advantage for you. A value center, by contrast, is creating economic value for the organization. Now, historically, service and support has been viewed as a cost center, and that's why the focus in many organizations is on minimizing the cost, and because it's a labor-intensive function, minimizing the headcount associated with service and support. But it's absolutely the wrong paradigm. It's absolutely the wrong mindset, because if you're starving service and support, minimizing the headcount, minimizing the resources they have, what you inadvertently do, unknowingly do, is drive up your total cost of ownership. Because if you're not investing in level one, if you're not investing in self-help, self-service, these issues, these incidents and service requests will be resolved at a much more costly level. Level 3 IT, vendor support, for example, field support. And so here's where the value proposition comes in, is that we found that the most effective service and support organizations think and act like businesses, because they know they create economic value. And you can create economic value through shift left, through channel mix, and by returning productive hours to end users. And we've been able to quantify each of these phenomenon, and we've been able to identify an ROI or develop an ROI methodology whereby we can determine what economic value is created by a service and support organization, divide that by the annual operating cost to come up with an ROI. So let's make up a scenario where an organization is spending $2 million a year on a level 1 service desk. And if we're able to measure the effect of shift left, of deflecting contacts into lower cost channels, and the biggest contributor of all, making end users more productive, we might be able to calculate an ROI of 400, 500, 600% or even more, meaning that they're creating economic value in the enterprise that is far in excess of their annual operating cost. Now, this is a game changer because if historically you've been viewed as a cost center, you're going to be under cost pressure and headcount pressure all the time, and it's not a pleasant way to run your business or your career or your work life. It just isn't. And most support organizations operate that way. They're in a defensive crouch, constantly having to defend their costs, their headcount. But if you can turn the tables around and demonstrate that you're generating ROI far in excess of your annual operating expense, the game changes. Because if I'm a rational manager and somebody presents evidence to me that says, we spend $2 million a year on our level 1 service desk, but we're creating $8 million in economic value. That's a 4-to-1 or a 400% ROI. If I'm a rational manager, I'm going to say, how much more of that investment can I buy? What do you need from me in terms of headcount, dollars, technology, training, you name it, because at an 800% ROI, I want that investment all day long. There are very few activities within any organization that produce that kind of ROI, but we find that quite routinely. Even organizations that don't do all that well on their benchmarks oftentimes have an ROI well in excess of 100%. And what drives me, David, in this industry more than anything else is the idea that we want to change hearts and minds, and we want to get the industry thinking about not just operating as a cost center, but operating as a value center and acting like a value center, which means that you operate like a business, think like a business, and you expect to get funded as a business because you're producing ROI in excess of 100%.
That's really interesting. I'd love to explore that more. Okay, hopefully we'll get some questions about ROI, because it's really important, I think, how practitioner organizations really get an opportunity and understanding of how to realize value from all this stuff we've talked about. I'll keep banging on about it, Jeff, right? Hindsight, insight, and foresight. I talk about that a lot, and it's really important to move away from that cost center sort of, we've got a ticket, we're going to close it, let's close it as quickly as we can, to this value thing. It really is really important, I think, over the next few years. So I'm hoping, listeners, if you've got any questions in relation to ROI, into any of what you've heard already, please type them into the panel provided there, and we'll get on to them. That makes perfect sense, to be honest. And one of the key things for me when I talk to organizations, when we go through our certification program, is aligning all that to business strategy, Jeff. So if you look at what you do, the activity you do, and the metrics that come out of what you do, what you measure is really, really important. When you think about aligning business strategy with mission, vision, values, critical success factors that you defined in KPIs, for me, it's very simple. That definition gives you an opportunity to control that through processes and governance and procedures, which gives you an opportunity to measure that. And what you can measure, you can improve. It's very simple. It's quite an old premise, really. What you can define, you can control. What you can control, you can measure. What you can measure, you can improve. So from aligning business strategy to KPIs, have you got any insight, any ideas, any thoughts on how organizations can do that more effectively? So in other words, we picked out some key sort of metrics earlier. How would you go around pulling those metrics to align, to make sure you've got the right KPIs that are aligning straight the way through to business strategy, so you can talk about the return on investment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the focus in most support organizations, David, tends to be very tactical. So I mentioned very early on, better, faster, cheaper. Better as measured by customer satisfaction or NPS or customer effort. Faster is measured by mean time to resolve or possibly ASA. Cheaper is measured by cost per ticket or cost per contact. Most organizations, the vast majority, are focused on those tactical measures, better, faster, cheaper, and it's not a bad focus because they do matter, and you want to get better, faster, and cheaper. But the connection between support and business metrics and aligning with the business is ROI, because then you're talking the language of business. business. Everyone understands ROI instinctively, and if you're looking at ROI in service and support, that is the strategic measure of success. So the better, faster, cheaper, cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, and mean time to resolve, tactical measures of success, ROI being the most important strategic measure of success. And as that ROI exceeds 100%, which is what you're looking for, creating value in excess of what your annual operating expense is, that is the most critical strategic metric, the most critical strategic measure of success. It's something that every organization understands. And if you are focused on ROI and you are measuring your ROI and reporting your ROI on a periodic basis, you will just by nature of tracking that metric, align yourself with the overall goals of the organization. So that connection between ROI and service and support and the financial well-being of the organization, the economic value of the organization, ROI, just talking about it, measuring it, reporting on it, will get you aligned with the overall enterprise. Now, there are other metrics that can be used for alignment, but the single most important way to be thinking about this is ROI. Most organizations, unfortunately, aren't thinking that way. Fewer than 5% actually measure their ROI, but the ones that are measuring and reporting on their ROI on a periodic basis have dramatically changed the mindset about service and support within their enterprises. And what we've seen is that the managed service providers that are coming to market with this value proposition, not just a better, faster, cheaper value proposition, but rather a value proposition that says, we're going to make your users at company XYZ more productive, and here's how we do it. That value proposition is really resonating, and what we're seeing is that market share is being captured by those MSPs, managed service providers, that are coming to market with an ROI value proposition.
Interesting. And again, I'm sure we could talk about that forever. And we hope, well, I can actually see one question we've got from one of the audience about that, which I will read out. And it's probably timely, actually, Jeff, to move on to audience questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So we'll have a little look at what we've got. I can see two in there. I'll ask the first one because I think it just leads on. And I think we may have covered it, Jeff, but I'll ask it again. It's from Sarah. No, actually, it's Stephen, sorry. How do you calculate the ROI on benchmarking, and what's the typical ROI? Now, we've covered it, right? I don't know if there's anything else you can maybe talk about there, and maybe the typical ROI, but there may even be an opportunity after this session for Stephen to engage with us to talk further about the granularity of some of that. But is there anything you want to add to that ROI thing? Because it is very important. And maybe what is the typical ROI that you see organizations achieving?
Right. The three big contributors, as I mentioned earlier, are shift left, channel mix, and productivity being returned to end users. I think we understand how you create value by shifting left. You reduce the cost per ticket by doing that. Channel mix, if you can deflect contacts into lower cost channels, and there is an overlap between shift left and channel mix. They are not mutually exclusive. But the productivity gains through service and support are a separate type of economic value. What we've discovered, David, is that the average user now has more than 3 devices. That will be a smartphone, it'll be a tablet, it'll be a desktop computer or a laptop computer. It might even be a server or a printer. But when those devices don't work the way they're supposed to, productivity will be impeded. Generally, you're not completely out of business, but there's going to be some productivity impediment. We've been able to measure that. The average end user loses about 27 productive hours a year due to various IT-related incidents, service requests, problems, and issues. And if you can return a user to service quickly, that is, go from 27 lost hours per year, which is 3.5 full days, and you can get that down to, that's significant. If you can get that down to 15 hours or 10 hours or 8 hours, you're returning those productive hours to those end users, and that can be monetized. So think of an organization that has 1,000 or 10,000 or even 100,000 employees, like some large organizations do. And if you are returning 10, 12, 15 productive hours per end user per year by virtue of the fact that you have high FCRs, low mean times to resolve, that can be monetized. And the return productivity is typically 3, 4, sometimes as much as 10 times what the annual operating cost of service and support is. So the biggest contributor to ROI is, in fact, the return productivity that you're able to give back to users that would otherwise be lost if they were working in an organization that did not have high performance IT service and support.
That's an incredible statistic, That's a very powerful statistic. And if you look at that 27 days of productivity, that's not even working days. Yeah, that's for 20 working days in a month. 27 days, or whatever you want to call it. That's a month's worth of payroll in an organization from a productivity point. It's incredible.
I may have misspoken. It's 27 hours per year. So I may have misspoken, okay. David. I apologize. Okay. Yeah, so it's 27 hours per year. So it's about 3.5 productive days per year, which is still pretty significant when you multiply it across the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees in an organization. And the goal is to get that number as low as possible. We've seen consistently that organizations that provide high quality support can get that number down to around 5 or 6 lost productive hours per year. Compare that to 27 hours. If you're returning 20 hours, almost 2.5 days of productivity per person per year, add that up, monetize it, you're talking about huge sums of money and very high ROIs far in excess of what the annual operating expense is.
Yes, and I think you can turn that on its head as well. So not only the lost productivity, Jeff, but productivity that you haven't gained yet through better use of technology and channel mix. So there's a flip side to that too. We've got another question, and this one is from Sarah. How would you go about making a business case for investing in benchmarking services? How do I get buy-in? Now that's a big question, Jeff, and I don't know if we've got enough time to really to go through that now. Maybe not. I tell you what we'll do. Look, we'll take some of these questions that we've had, and we'll pull together something that we feed back into the guys that have attended today. We have got another couple of questions as well. We've got one from Nabil, which talks about ROI from a strategic point, a success point, and what he's saying is he doesn't believe that some people in organizations really understand how to actually calculate. And I think he's got a fair point there. I think, again, we can maybe feed some information back into the listeners after this webinar with some information about that. We've also got one as well from Francois. And Francois is asking a brilliant question about how he gets access to external benchmarking data reports to compare with his services. Again, Francois, we can feed some of that information back in. Now, before we close, there is an opportunity, guys. If you want to further engage on this, because it's a very, very important subject matter, and not very often do we do this, but we do give the opportunity for sometimes for listeners to engage directly with our speakers. In this case, we're offering a 30-minute briefing with Jeff directly on the back of this. Okay. Now it is interesting, and if I can get this to work, I'll do it now. There we go. So I'm going to launch this. If you are interested in learning more and talking more about your service challenge specifically, by all means, give the yes a click, and we'll follow up with some more information and an opportunity for you to speak to Jeff as well. I think what we'll do as well, Jeff, we'll gather some of those questions, because we have got a few that more have come in as well since I've been talking. We'll gather some of those questions, and again, we'll feed those back in to the listeners. I think that's pretty much it. I've got a few more questions myself, Jeff, but I just think we've run out of time, unfortunately. Again, we'll cover off that. So is there anything else you'd like to just finish with, Jeff, before we close, maybe?
Just a couple things, David. First, thank you so much for this opportunity, and for the listeners, I thank you so much, because I know your time is valuable, and the fact that you were able to spend this time with David and myself this morning, that means a lot to me. As far as the questions go, there are 2 venues here. We can schedule something over the phone, but I would encourage all of you to go to the SDI conference later this month, and I would love to meet you in person, and I can meet with you one-on-one at the SDI conference, along with David, of course. So there's a couple different ways that you might engage with us and SDI going forward. But if you're not registered for the SDI conference later this month, please do so. I'd love to meet you there in person.
Well, that's a brilliant point, Jeff. I was going to close with that. So you're absolutely right. Jeff is again joining us this year. I think Jeff is keynoting as well, which is superb. The conference is in Birmingham. You mentioned IBM Watson earlier, Jeff. We've got IBM Watson there. We've got Deutsche Bank. I think it's Deutsche Bank or Danske Bank actually, who implemented Watson. So they're going to be talking about their Watson story, which is going to be really exciting as well. So yes, Jeff will be there, and certainly we can hopefully have an opportunity to meet and listen to Jeff at the same time as well. So that's superb. We're going to close on that, guys. It's been really interesting. I love all this stuff, Jeff. So thank you for your time. Always a pleasure, and obviously looking forward to seeing you again at the end of March at conference. I'd like to thank Zoe as well from SDI for managing today's webinar, and thank you to you guys. Thank you to our listeners for joining us today. I hope you've learned something, and I really hope that's excited you, because this stuff is really, really massively important to support organizations as we move into the next sort of decade. So thank you for listening, guys. We'll see you soon. Good luck and goodbye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jeff.